Reis opp.
This public defense of the thesis entitled Improving Teaching and Movement Strategies for Skill Learning and Performance in Skilled and Elite Alpine Ski Racers. Today's candidate, Christian Magelssen, completed his thesis in July 2024. And based on a proposal from the Department of Physical Performance, the Committee for Research Education has appointed the following committee to judge the thesis and other requirements for the award. Professor Anne Marte Pensgaard, Norwegian School of Sports Sciences, Chair. Associate Professor Keith Lowes, Washington University School of Medicine, USA, first opponent. And Professor Lowes is with us on video today. Professor Joseph Gallia, University of Birmingham, UK, second opponent. This committee has concluded that the thesis meets the standard worthy of a public defense for the award of Doctor of Philosophy, PhD in Sport Science. Earlier today, the candidate has given a trial lecture with the title, The Neural Basis of Motor Skill Learning. The trial lecture has been found satisfactory by the examination committee. I now would like to ask the candidate to introduce his doctoral research in the form of a short lecture, and the opposing members of the examination committee to engage the candidate in the defense of the work. And should members of the audience want to ask questions related to the research, I ask you to bring these in written form to the attention of the chairperson, which is me, in the break prior to the second opponent's questions. Then I ask the candidate to take his place at the lectern.
Thank you very much, and welcome to this presentation about my doctoral thesis called Improving Teaching and Movement Strategies for Skill Learning and Performance in Skilled and Elite Alpine Ski Racers. And with that, let's get started. We humans, we have an exceptional capacity to learn new skills. For instance, we can learn to skate, we can learn to drive a car, or we can learn to ski with just a reasonable amount of practice. Now, when we learn these skills, it is believed that we go through various stages of learning, and a well-known cognitive model that describes this learning process is called the Fitz and Posner model, and that goes like this. So on the x-axis, we have skill level, and on the y-axis, we have the cognitive load of the learner. So when we begin to learn a skill, we begin in the so-called cognitive phase, where the skill demands lots of cognitive resources to perform. The skill execution in this stage is error-prone, so you do lots of mistakes. And the skill is performed in a very step-by-step manner. So first you need to think about this, and then that, and then this. And that takes lots of cognitive resources. With more practice, we transition over to the associative phase, where there is slightly less cognitive resources. Skill execution is less error-prone, so we perform the skill better. And finally, we reach the autonomous phase, where the skill now requires less cognitive resources, the performance is smooth, and we do not do that many mistakes. And because we don't require that much cognitive resources anymore, we can perform a secondary task without that task compromising performance of the first task. Now, these stages of learning give rise to a learning curve which looks something like this. So we have a rapid improvement in skill performance in the very beginning, but then that performance levels off as we enter the autonomous phase in the very late stages of learning. Now, an important prediction from learning theories of expert performance is that once we have reached this autonomous phase, we are not expected to improve that much with the same type of practice. So repeating more training on the automated solution is not expected to improve performance in the autonomous phase. So what is required for us to become better in skill is that we need knowledge of better strategies. So what is required for us in order to improve is that we need knowledge of the strategies. So we have to take our automated solution, we have to break it up into different components, then we had to add new and better strategy, and then we had to recompile it to a new and better version of the skill. And that's the key idea. The problem is that many athletes are stuck in this phase, in an autonomous phase, because they lack knowledge of better strategies or more effective strategies. So the question is, are there better training methods that can improve elite performance so that they also can improve skill performance? In recent years, cognitive science has made great strides in understanding the learning mechanism that drives skill learning, and so can maybe help athletes to become better in their skill. And these learning mechanisms are error-based learning, use-dependent learning, reinforcement learning, and strategy. Now, I will not go into details about each of these strategies now, but it is important for me to say that each of these learning components has their own neural substrate that perform their own computations. So, can knowledge from cognitive science be used to train athletes more effectively? Perhaps, but most of these studies have used very simple tasks like the one I will show you now. So this is a simple reaching task. The performer sits in front of a table and has to move the cursor towards the target. And the arm is hidden, so the learner cannot see the arm. And this is, of course, a very simple task. Everyone can do that. But then on some trials, the scientist decides to give the cursor a rotation from the starting point. So that happened, and then the learner misses the targets. That causes an error, and the learner needs to adapt to this kind of rotation. And that happens by moving the arm towards the right. And then the learner again hits the targets. Now, these tasks are very simple, and it just takes minutes, hours, and sometimes days. And that's very, very different from this the skills in real-world learning, which takes many years to be good at, like, for instance, tennis, golf, and skiing. And so the overall aim of this thesis was to bridge the gap between lab-based skills and real-world learning. And to do this, I used alpine ski racing as a testbed to study skill learning in skilled and elite athletes. Now, please remember, skilled athletes, they need knowledge of better strategies to perform their performance. So if we want to do a learning study with skilled athletes, we need them to learn something new. Otherwise, we will not have a good learning study. So to tackle this problem, I used an interdisciplinary approach grounded in mechanics and psychology, where mechanics was used to develop strategies to improve performance and to test. And a goal for this thesis was to test the effect of these strategies. The doctoral thesis aimed to answer two broad questions. How can skiers improve their performance? What strategies can they use? And the other question was, what are the most effective teaching strategies to learn these effective strategies? So we dive into the first question. And this is alpine skiing. The goal is to ski a course in the shortest time possible. So it is to get from start to the finish area in the shortest time. Now, if you look at the best skiers in the world, you will sometimes see very small, tiny differences between the races in the finish area. However, if you zoom into different sections of the course, then you will find quite big differences. And previous studies, they have identified three crucial sections where large time differences arises, and that is the start, the hairpin, and the flat section. And what you can see is that the flat section covers a lot, typically covers a lot of the overall course. So that's a very important section. And that's why I decided to use this section and study that in my doctoral thesis. So the next question is, what can slalom skiers do to improve their performance on flat slopes in slalom? And we proposed 4 strategies to improve performance in this section, each carefully selected to enhance performance in this section by taking advantage of principles from mechanics. So the first strategy was to stand against, and that was just to resist the forces in the turn and not being compressed towards the bindings in the turn. And we thought that maybe that was the worst. Then we had a strategy which was to rock skis forward. So after gate passage, just rock skis forward. And then we had the extend, which was to extend the legs in the turn, also called pumping. And then finally, we had the extend with rock skis forward, which was a combination of rock skis forward and extend. And importantly, we believe that this was going to be the best strategy. So the first question of this thesis was, which strategies do skilled skiers perform best with on flat slopes in slalom? And to test this, we used a flat section of the race hill in Snø in Oslo, in the indoor skiing hall. And we set up a slalom course using stubbies. And then these are data generated from 98 elite and skilled skiers from Norway and Sweden, very high-level skiers. And each of these skiers, they performed each strategy twice, and the practice order were handled probabilistically, so we randomly assigned them to the skiers. And here is a video trying to illustrate this. So we had a racer standing behind the start gate, and here you see the timing starts, and here you see the course, and you perform one of the strategies, and you can see this is the end of the course, so it's not a very long course. And here are the key results. And these are the effect of movement strategies on slalom performance. And the skiers used approximately 16 seconds to complete the slalom course. And what we found was that the best strategy, as I expected, was to extend with rock skis forward. The worst strategy was to stand against. That was almost 0.5 seconds slower, on average. Then we had the rock skis forward. And then we had the extend strategy, which was almost as good as extend with rock skis forward. Okay, so we see quite clear differences between the strategies. So based on the first question, we found that the extend with rock skis forward strategy was on average the fastest. This strategy was, however, only marginal better than the extend strategy alone. So we found that this extend strategy was a very important strategy. And the second question we had was, what are the kinematic changes resulting from a training intervention on the extend strategy? And I will not go into details about these results, but we had a baseline test with the skiers, and then we had a retention test with the skiers. And these are the differences. So this was before the skiers learned the strategy, and this was after. And what we can see is that this is velocity, and we see quite a distinct signature of this like extend strategy when the learners learn that strategy. So now we have gained a better understanding of what strategies skiers can use to improve their performance. And then we move on to the second question. What are the most effective teaching strategies to learn these effective strategies? In alpine skiing, and perhaps in many other sports, instruction is the typical teaching strategy. So it is very common when you are an athlete to be told what to do in a particular situation. So for instance, you can see here we have two lines, line A and line B. Now, the typical way to teach athletes this is to tell the skier to choose either A or AB based on the coach's expertise or preference. Now, there are some challenges with this instruction-based teaching, and that is the coach advice may not be the optimal solution, as what coaches judge as a good strategy does not always align with reality, even for the best trained eye. And the second challenge is that learners may not learn to select different and appropriate strategies for each unique situation. So when you use instruction, it is very common to think that, okay, now we have a perfect turn, and we have a perfect solution, and you do this in every single turn. And that may be a challenge. Another way to do this is that you use something called reinforcement learning. And the cornerstone of reinforcement learning is that we learn through evaluation instead of instruction. So suppose we have 3 different actions. We have action A, B, and C. Now, each of these strategies have their own expected outcome. So if I perform action number C, this is what I expect to get from that strategy. And this expected outcome allows us to compare the values, and that allows us to choose the action or strategy that we think has the lowest value, or the best in this case. And then we can perform a trial with that strategy, and we can observe the outcome we get from the environment, from the timing system, for instance. And then that allows us to compare the current trial with the expected outcome of this strategy. And if these are different, that results in a reward prediction error, and then we need to update the value of the chosen strategy. So in reinforcement learning, learning is driven by reward prediction errors, which are the difference between the actual and predicted rewards. These reward prediction errors can be better than expected, similar to expectation, or worse than expected. So in the case of a better than expected performance, maybe the take-home message is to maybe choose this strategy in the future. They can also be similar to expectation, and that's when they are equivalent. And then the take-home message is maybe choose this strategy in the future if it's a good strategy. Or it can be worse than expected, and that's maybe the take-home message is that you maybe should avoid that strategy in the future. Maybe it was not that good after all. There is some interesting things, and that's it seems that these reward prediction errors are encoded in the midbrain, in the dopamine neurons, which I will not go into details right now. So our third question was, which teaching strategies, teaching signal for instruction and feedback is most effective for helping skiers to learn effective strategies? So to address this question, we created 3 learning groups, each of which learned these strategies in a different way. We had a supervised target skill learning group, and here we recruited coaches to instruct the skiers in what we believe to be the best strategy. That was the extend with rock skis forward. And then give feedback on how the skiers performed that strategy. Okay? We believe that this was actually the best learning group, so it was an upward comparison for the other learning groups. Then we had a second learning group, that was the supervised free choice learning group, and here we recruited coaches from the test group that were participated in the learning study. And their task was to choose a strategy for each trial, what they believe to be the best strategy for this particular skier. And then give feedback how the skier performed that strategy. Then we compared that learning group to a reinforcement learning group, and here we did not assign them a coach, but the learner had to try one strategy for each trial, and then learn the value of that strategy by seeing the time. And we predicted that this was going to be better than this supervised free choice learning group. And here is the procedure. So we had a 3-day learning experiment. We started with a baseline test with the skiers just ski as fast as they could down the course that you just saw, with no knowledge of these strategies. Then we had a forced exploration phase where the skier tested all strategies. So all skiers tested all strategies. And then we had a free choice sessions where the skiers or the coach chose strategy for the learner. And then we had day 3 where we removed the coach. So now all the skiers selected the strategy that they thought was going to be the best. And here are the results. So what you see here is that we have the 3 learning groups again, and then we have some sessions during the training. And here are race times, so better, lower here is better performance. During forced exploration, where the skiers tried all the different strategies, we did not find any statistically significant differences between the learning groups, and that's because they tried all the strategies. Then in the free choice phase, where the skier or the coach could select strategies, then we found that all learning groups improved massively. And that's because they could start to select the strategy they thought was going to be the best. However, we found that from this phase to this phase, we found that the supervised target skill learning group improved more than the reinforcement learning group. And that's probably because this learning group selected the best strategy from the very beginning. In the free choice phase, we found that the reinforcement learning group, they continued to improve, but that did not happen in the other learning groups. So we found that overall there was a bigger improvement in the reinforcement learning group compared to the standard coaching group during training. During retention, that's the final day, we found that the reinforcement learning group performed better than the standard coaching group. And it also performed actually better than the learning group that we thought was going to be the best. We did not find, we found the same trends during the transfer test, but that was not statistically significant. So, conclusion based on question 3. Reinforcement learning group improved more during training and performed better at retention than the traditional coaching group. We did not find that the reinforcement learning group learned to select better strategies measured as the single best strategy. But we found that the skiers in the reinforcement learning group who made suboptimal choices during retention incurred a lower cost for their choices than did the skiers in the supervised learning group. Now, these are maybe a bit confusing because I haven't showed you the results, but that's some key conclusion from the study. Our final question was, do skiers learn better by increasing the frequency at which they are exposed to new learning problems? So in alpine skiing, it is very typical to experience new courses all the time. So the question is, how should we train these courses? One way to do this is to say, okay, we have 3 different courses. One way to do it is that we use a blocked training program in which we just repeat the trials on the course, many trials in a row. So we do C, 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 A, B, B, B. Another way to do it is to use something called interleaved practice, and that's just randomly assigning the courses. So that for each trial, the learner needs to learn a new course. And there are some previous research under this learning effect called the contextual interference that shows that training using interleaved practice leads to better learning compared to block practice, at least in the laboratory. And some theoretical explanation for this contextual interference effect is the elaborate distinctiveness hypothesis, and this claims that the interleaved practice allows learner to compare and contrast tasks during the inter-trial period. And that gives a better memory representation. So after one trial, you can compare that trial to another learning problem. Another explanation is the forgetting reconstruction hypothesis, and that claims that interleaved practice works by causing learners to forget the active working memory content from trial to trial. So here we have active working memory for this learning problem, and then we need to switch to another working memory for that action, and then we have to switch back. And this forgetting is good for learning. So our fourth question, do skiers learn better by increasing the frequency at which they are exposed to new learning problems? And to address this question, we conducted a 5-day learning experiment in the indoor skiing hall. So we begin with a baseline test where the skiers skied all the courses in a random order. And then we assigned them to the 2 groups, interleaved group, which skied all the courses in a random order every day. And then a block group which finished all the trials for one course before moving to the next. Then we had a 72 hours retention period, and then after that we had a retention period, where again the skiers skied all the courses in a random order. And we did this with 66 skilled alpine ski racers from Norway. These are the results from the training acquisition. We did not find convincing evidence that interleaved learning group performed better during the training than the block group. And this is what you can see here. We found that all groups improved their performance across the trial blocks for course A, B, and C, but we did not find any difference between the groups. We did not find convincing evidence that the interleaved learning group performed better than the block group during the retention. So again, these are course A, B, and C, and we don't see that much difference between the learning group. So, conclusion based on question 4, we did not find corroborating evidence for the contextual interference effect. This null effect may be due to complexity of alpine skiing as a sport and the high skill level of our skiers. So, to summarize this thesis, the overall aim of this thesis was to bridge the gap between lab-based skills and the real-world learning. And some general conclusion from this study is that we found that the extend with rock skis forward strategy was the best strategy on average. We found that learning strategy values through reinforcement learning can be a useful teaching approach in alpine skiing and perhaps so in many other sports. We did not find convincing evidence for the contextual interference effect, and overall we found that the interdisciplinary approach between mechanics and psychology was a very successful method for studying skill learning in real-world contexts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation of your thesis. Then it's time to invite our first opponent to engage the candidate in a discussion of the doctoral research. So the question is if we have the video going. Thumbs up. So Associate Professor Keith Losey, we can see you on the screen now. Welcome as first opponent. The stage is yours.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me, Christian. Thank you for a wonderful trial lecture earlier and for your presentation now. I think throughout everything you presented, it's some really, really interesting interdisciplinary work. And I think, sort of the technical hurdles you had to navigate are really impressive. And as always, I'm blown away by the visualizations that you've put together, both in the written document and the presentation. So I have a few questions, and I think probably the biggest one to start with, which you did address a little bit in the written document, but I'm curious to hear a more detailed answer, is, obviously participants were doing something different as a result of kind of these different strategies because you saw their race times change. But without like a detailed kind of kinematic analysis, how do you know they were really doing what you wanted them to do? Were they truly using those strategies effectively, or can you speak to that, or how well you can support the validity that manipulation was successful?
Yep. Can you hear me? Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, that's a very good question. The short answer is that I really don't know. The long answer is maybe that we did everything we could so as the learner actually implemented the strategy in the way we wanted. So before we began, before the skiers tested the strategies, we had like familiarization trials where we went through the different strategies, and then we ticked off if the skiers actually could perform that strategy like in a decent way. Now there are some like variability in how the skiers performed it, of course. So it's not like, I don't think it could be like, okay, all skiers perform extend with rock skis forward strategy like perfect. And maybe not the way we wanted, but that at least was the way the skiers tried to implement the strategy. And I tried to be clear about that, but that's always, that was a tricky question, and I didn't know. Yeah, I tried everything I could to like write it as clear as I could. That these strategies have the skiers implemented the strategies, but we ticked off if they could perform it in a like decent way.
Yeah, so that's helpful, right? To establish that the skiers at least can do the thing you're asking them to do. But just as I'm trying to picture the experiment, you are there and the coaches are there also in the ski hall with them. So I guess even just qualitatively, in your personal opinion, did it look like the skiers were reasonably effectively implementing these strategies as you watched them?
Yeah, that's I think so. Especially like the last learning study, like maybe not the first, because we used very good skiers in the last study. Like the skiers in the first study was like good, but in the last study they were like very, very good skiers. So once we have like talked about the strategies, they are very quick to understand what they're going to do. And I think because I observed, I had to do that, then I think they implemented it well. And also that's what I think we can see from the results, is that there are some differences between the strategies and how the skiers perform them. So even though I don't know if the skiers perform the strategies perfectly, it still shows up as a clear difference in terms of performance.
Yeah, it's actually that goes into another question I had really nicely, because you saw some pretty big differences in performance, especially in a very skilled population, but much more skilled than the average, motor learning study, which uses novice students who are not familiar with some novel task. So I was really surprised to see such, relatively big changes in performance for people whose performance is pretty stable. So could you maybe address that a little bit? Like how novel are these strategies in the world of, pretty elite ski racing? And are there any sort of implications from this work immediately for like coach education or coaching practice?
That's a brilliant question. Where do I start? When I started this project, I think maybe coaches have some idea how to perform better in flat slopes. But that's like, I don't think they are very aware of like the pumping and all the different strategies. They usually think about how they like the skiers perform, how they look and stuff like that. And they don't think in terms of mechanics. Like, of course they think in terms of mechanics in some kind of way, but it's usually they think the aesthetics of the performance instead of like the actual actional effect that we want to accomplish. And in the literature, it has been suggested previously that pumping could be an effective strategy. But when we look at the literature, at least until 2012, like scientists have been very skeptical about these strategies. They don't think that they can actually improve performance. And when we look at coaches, they have also, maybe not all, but some, are very skeptical about these strategies. And that's why I think the skiers, when we give them these strategies, it's novel for the skiers. They don't know exactly how they can improve performance. Like, they don't know the strategies, and that's maybe what we see, that they improve a lot. So, yeah. But, yeah, it's a tricky question to, give a like short and conclusive answer to.
Yeah, that's helpful. Because I don't know the alpine ski racing world at all. So, I would usually expect like pretty tiny adjustments, right, within what an expert is capable of doing. But you definitely saw things that I would think are practically significant for a racer, right? And that if you just adopt this different strategy, which they could pick up pretty quickly, it really led to some meaningful changes.
Yeah. I have to add one more thing to that, because now we have isolated the training to one area, like one section of the course. And that's not very typical for alpine skiers. So when we like try to isolate that, maybe we see some massive improvement because we just focus on one particular element of the course. And we don't know if actually this translates to an actual performance in the real world, because then you need to adapt to maybe many types of situation. So maybe that's also why we see this massive difference between the strategies.
Yeah, so it is obviously like taking a piece of the whole, right, and kind of working on it in isolation. But it seems like you have a really good representative environment where that should transfer into real world performance. Do you now, or do you in the future have any plans to sort of follow up with any of these athletes and see how their strategy use maybe has changed in the real environment?
That would be an amazing study to actually like do a kind of study in the ski hall and see if that is like transferred to the real world, and do like field-based like kinematic studies in the field. Like that would be awesome, I think. But that's like very, very challenging to do. But of course, that would be an amazing study.
Yeah, well, I was thinking even just like surveying them on their strategies, you know, and sort of what they intend to use. Like a detailed actual biomechanical assessment would be pretty phenomenal in real ski racing. But back to your studies specifically. So I had one question where you were comparing, you know, sort of the coach-led decisions to the athlete-led decisions. And interpreting that really through the lens of reinforcement learning, which I think makes sense because the athlete, right, has to kind of explore these different strategic choices and see what is best for them. But to what extent do you think that you can really isolate that as reinforcement learning per se? Or is that sort of a benefit of just self-guided learning, where, you know, it's not necessarily like the trial and error mechanisms at a neural level that you brought up in your talk, but it's more that like I have some personal schedule, and, you know, I have proprioceptive information available to me, lots of internal information available to me that coaches don't have. And therefore, I'm just able to make a better decision for my own learning. And it's more the self-guided aspect of that than it is the reinforcement aspect of that. So if that makes sense, I guess my question is, to what extent do you think it is one or the other, or can those even be really distinguished?
Yep, that's a good question. Maybe I start if they could be distinguished. I don't think they can be distinguished in like it's not supervised learning or reinforcement learning. I think it's a mixture of everything. So the important thing about my study is that I wanted to see if we can shift focus to a like more reinforcement learning approach. Could that help learning? Could that like help the learners to understand what they are doing and maybe make better choices? But as I like talked in the trial lecture today, like supervised learning operate at so many levels. So you have like one is like you have for supervised learning for decision making, and then that's one component of supervised learning. Then you have like when the skiers come into the experiment and they experience this icy snow, then there is like supervised learning because they adapt, and that's what we see in the first trial. That's maybe not like learning per se, but it's like trying to adapt to the conditions. So that's why we see like this fast improvement in the very first turns. And of course, for like reinforcement learning, that's it's one signal that they can use to learn is the times, right? But they also get like massive feedback from when they do the turns. And that's also one way they get feedback. And if it feels good, maybe you should repeat that. And that's maybe some kind of like a reward signal as well. Yeah, it's very tricky to combine. But in alpine skiing, doing this kind of reinforcement learning, like very test strategies, that's not done at all, I think. So that's like very, very, very different from the typical training that the skiers do. Mm-hmm. Then your second question was, I forgot. Sorry, I forgot.
Well, no, that's okay. I think it was more just like if those were dissociable, do you think it was like mostly reinforcement learning, or was it more kind of like cognitive mechanisms from self-guided learning and choosing my own schedule. But it sounds like part of this is, like those are just very hard to dissociate. So maybe it is hard to pin down, is it 70% reinforcement or 100% reinforcement?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. When we look at, first of all, from an athlete's perspective, you have all these different strategies. So we have 4 different strategies, and compared to like lab-based tasks, these strategies are very important for the athletes. So when they are participate in these learning experiments, I don't think they will waste their time on doing a strategy which will not lead to success. So I think what they really wanted to do was to learn the best strategy, and that's what I saw is that the skiers in the reinforcement learning group learned some strategies, but then on some trials later, they actually tried another strategy, and that was like, oh, that was bad, and then they didn't do that anymore. And that's also what we kind of see in the win, stay, lose shift model. Did the skiers repeat the trials that were successful, or like did they not? And then we find for like both the reinforcement learning group and the standard coaching group, they had like a higher probability of repeating that strategy if that was a good strategy than if the strategy was good. So I don't know, but I think it is some kind of like reinforcement learning involved in this like decision. But yeah.
No, I agree. And so that another question I had in that experiment was, you saw this benefit of the reinforcement learning manipulation in the retention test. But if remembering your data correctly, right, actually there was, if there was any benefit, it was actually for the supervised learning in kind of those initial free choice periods. So could you explain like a little bit about why you saw that reinforcement learning benefit at retention, but not during a more like acute performance setting? And was that something you predicted, or do you have kind of an explanation for why you may only see that retention effect?
Yeah. Do you mean like a difference between the retention and transfer? Or is it like, or just to repeat the question one more time? So.
Yeah. So why do you think you only saw the benefit of the reinforcement learning manipulation at retention, as opposed to a benefit like during the free choice period that then is also maintained in retention?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we saw this bigger improvement in the reinforcement learning group over the course of the trial, but we did not see like the difference between the groups at each session. And one thing is that there is like massive, because the skiers tried the different strategies, and that creates like a variability in the. So that could like we don't, because they try different actions and that play out on the performance, then like that's very hard to detect with a statistically significant like test. So that's maybe one thing, but another thing is that yeah, that could be one explanation. At retention, that's I think we saw that because we also used like a stronger statistical test in some kind of way. So we used an ANCOVA, like a multi-level ANCOVA, and then we that is expected to give like higher power for like, yeah. So that's another answer for this, yeah, why we see it. And maybe one challenge I have had during this experiment is like, now I don't remember the word for it, but it's like leakage between the skiers. So when we performed the free choice learning sessions in different sessions between supervised learning and reinforcement learning, but that we could not do that during the retention test. So then we had all the skiers together. So what I think, and that's maybe not like the optimal, is that the skier watched each other during retention. And that's, I think they learned from each other, and that's maybe not what we see in transfer. That's why, because they learned, there was some like different kind of learning, so yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem, obviously, for doing more applied research, right? Because you have to just have these logistical constraints of, you have to have all these athletes in one space.
Yeah.
But that does compromise some experimental control.
Yep.
So you mentioned like the ANCOVA, and overall I thought like your statistical approaches were sound throughout the dissertation. I did have a question, because in a few places you switch from sort of a frequentist statistics where you're doing hypothesis testing into Bayesian statistics to estimate some of these parameters. So I was wondering if you could first maybe just talk through your motivation for doing that. Why did you go from, because you could do estimation in a frequentist sense as well, just presenting a 95% confidence interval. So maybe my first question is just if you could explain what motivated you to dip into Bayesian statistics in some of these sections.
That's a very tricky question, and that could be a very long question, and it can be a long discussion. But I think I will start to talk about my motivation, because the problem for me in doing this kind of studies is to design studies where I actually have that are informative studies. So I tried, when I started my PhD, I looked at everything. How can I do these tests better? How can I design these studies well and informative? And then in 2022, I started reading Bayesian statistics. So I went through Kvarsky, I went to Richard courses, and then for maybe 6 months, I was a Bayesian. I think that was the only solution to do this kind of field studies. And that was great, actually. I learned very much from learning these, taking these courses and learn, But then sooner I found out that maybe that's not the solution for a cognitive, like psychology, because right now I'm like a mixture, Bayesian and frequentist, and I don't think Bayesian statistics actually solve some of the real problems that we face in psychology. And that's because we want to build theories, and we want to test theories, and the statistical test that you use is that's a tool to help us make those decisions and learn. But it is important to test theories. That's my opinion. Then why I did this kind of differences between frequentist hypothesis testing and the more estimation approach that you talked about is that's my preference for doing things. I don't say that that's the way people should do it. But reading Kvarsky, Bayesian, the new Bayesian world and stuff like that, he separate out, okay, we have this matrix, either you do testing or either you do, what's the other thing, frequentist or Bayesian. And then I think Bayesian statistics is great for like estimation approaches. And one reason I think that is that it's very nice to like communicate the results in some kind of way. I think it's easier. I don't think maybe all agree, but I think it's easier, and that's because you have this opportunity to add intervals around your group level. So if you have like ski academies, you have participants, it's very easy to just, okay, now I want to make predictions for this group level structure in my data. You can do that with frequentist statistics, and I think like there is one, I don't know his name at the moment, but he actually communicated out with the developers of the LME4 package, and hey, I have this code to implement it, but they didn't accept it, and then, yeah. But there are some ways to do it, but I think it's very easy and nice to do it in a Bayesian way. Yeah, it's just my preference to do things. Yeah.
Well, I think that's very reasonable, and like you said, I think there are some benefits, especially when it comes to estimation, of going through the extra steps of calculating a Bayesian credible interval, because it does have a more straightforward interpretation in terms of how we think about probability. You know, and I say, okay, if there's a 95% chance that this is where the true value is, as opposed to the frequentist definition, right, which is that, you know, okay, 95% of intervals that are drawn to this width will eventually, in the long run, contain the true value.
Yep.
That's a really hard thing to wrap your head around. But I think, you know, one of the things that makes it difficult, obviously, is that the Bayesian analyses comes with additional assumptions and a lot of computational power is required. So I think in my final question for you is just that it wasn't clear to me in reading your document what kind of prior distributions you used for those Bayesian intervals. So could you just explain like what priors you chose and why?
Yeah, maybe I can start with the second paper, because then I use some Bayesian generalized additive models. If that's okay, Keith?
Yeah.
So these general additive models are very complex. It's very hard to interpret them. Like they are not like parametric tests. So it's it's not like you are putting this equation and I'm going to estimate beta or alpha coefficient or stuff like that. It's like, okay, now I have this data, I'm adding some basis function, and then I want to estimate the value of this basis function so as not to overcomplicate the model. So to avoid overfitting. Now, I started the course with Richard in 2022, and then I didn't know anything about generalized additive models at all. But I read something in the chapter in Richard's book, and then that was about generalized additive models. And then I said, okay, this is a great tool to actually estimate things in like kinematic data. So I wanted to dive into that, and then I took courses with Gavin Simpson. I think I was not a good student because I asked him a lot of questions about how to implement it on Twitter, and it was like every day was full discussion. But then I learned a lot. But one thing I learned is that putting sensitive, like adding priors to generalized additive models is a nightmare. That's very, very hard to do. I think it's reasonable. Some kind look at like if you have like some like what to say it, the overall trends. That is one that's simple to do. It's not simple, but it makes sense to do it, and you can actually make prior predictions and okay, this looks reasonable. When it comes to like this group level structure in your data, that's very tricky to put priors on them. And I reach out to Buchner, now I don't remember the name, but yeah, we implemented the BRMS, we developed that package, and he said, hey, Christian, thanks for reaching out, but that's not possible. And then I had a conversation with Gavin, and he said, okay, it's not possible. Then in order to do that, then you need to dive into stand code to implement reasonable priors. So then my decision was just to use some very vague priors for that kind of model, so as not to like give it a massive weight in the estimation. So that was my solution. Another thing is that these models takes very, very long time to estimate. So on my computer, it took 2 days per model. So that takes a lot of time. And I had many models. So then the time goes, and yeah. So I was very vague, and that was on purpose, I think. Yeah. But at least I show what I had done. I tried. I don't remember if I did prior predictive simulation, but I think I did it. At least in some papers I did it. Now, the other model I did, you remember contextual interference, then we had some null effects. And I thought maybe, how should I deal with them? Because I hate studies when I read, we didn't find anything, and then I think, okay, your conclusion is that we did not find anything, but what is the reason why you didn't find? Was it an underpowered study and stuff like that? And that's a decision I don't want to make. That's, in my context, that's a decision I don't want to make. Saying that there is no difference when it could be a difference, but I didn't design a study to test those differences appropriately. So I thought maybe I can use an equivalence test in that setting. But then my problem was that I didn't know anything about equivalence testing when I started my PhD. And so to do this kind of equivalence testing, then you need to have some idea about what is the smallest effect size of interest that you want to study. And of course I didn't have that in the first study. And so thought, okay, maybe I could come up with some idea about how to do that in the when I wrote the thesis. But then I decided maybe I should go and talk with Dan Quintana, and I did that. And he said maybe you should try to do a Bayes factor analysis. And this is what I did, and that was what I learned from that is that these models are very, very sensitive to priors. And then for that kind of analysis, I use some sensitivity analysis. I tried different priors, and then I reported that in a supplementary paper in the thesis. But that is very, very, like, they are very, very sensitive to priors for that kind of model comparison between the hypothesis model and the null model. So, yeah. Yeah, so
yeah, that's great. I think you addressed some of the technical challenges, right? Like I'd actually never seen a Bayesian GAM model until I saw what you were doing in your paper, and I think like an uninformative prior makes a lot of sense in that situation. And then it is always the good and the bad thing about, I think, a lot of Bayesian analyses, right? Is that or this has always been my struggle with sort of subjective Bayes versus empirical Bayes, is unless you actually have a lot of empirical data that you can point to for your prior, you have to run a series of different priors, and then you find out that your answer was very sensitive to whatever you assumed in the priors, which is always a bit of a challenge. But I think that was a reasonable answer, and I think it was really good for you, probably from a professional development standpoint, right, to explore some of these things you were interested in, and build some of those skills in the dissertation. So I just wanted to commend you for that. And we might be ahead of schedule, but you've answered all of my questions. So very well done.
Thanks.
Thank you very much to the first opponent, and thank you both of you for a very interesting discussion so far. The discussion will continue with the second opponent after a break. So now we'll have a 15 minutes break, and we'll be back in the auditorium 5 minutes to 1. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. It's time to introduce the second opponent, Professor Joseph Gallia, who will continue the discussion with the candidate. So, please.
Hello. So I just want to say, really enjoyed reading your thesis. Thought it was superb, and really impressed how you've tried to translate some of these kind of very mechanistic ideas into applied setting. And being someone that works with these very simple tasks, I've got a lot of respect for the complexity that it must have involved. So well done. My plan is kind of to go through the chapters, and hopefully we'll get through them all. So, in the first chapter, you suggest that alpine skiing is a good test bed for elite sports due to its variability. So, what sports do you think is similar to alpine skiing that these kind of results are generalizable to, and what sports do you think that it wouldn't be generalizable to? Do you think you can make that distinction?
That's a question I never actually thought so much about, but I think it can generalize to many other sports. I think the problem is perhaps like team sports. That's the one I've been really find it difficult to generalize to, but that's because maybe my knowledge of the sport is too short. But everything, when we have to make decisions in an uncertain environment, I think that's one of the key tasks where I think the results can be applicable to. So like motorsport, where you have like different kinds of decisions where you have to make, like Formula 1. Yep. I think tennis is also a good example of it. Like you have to respond to the opponent, what they do. And I think that's like one area. So really everything where like the learner is uncertain about the environment. I think that's like good sports to generalize to.
Okay, so you've actually answered quite a few questions, I suppose, around the neural basis of supervised versus reinforcement learning. But I think one aspect which maybe wasn't covered so much in the lecture, which you kind of go over in chapter 2, is there any neural basis for a difference between blocked versus interleaved training? So did you think of using these because you think that this is going to engage fundamentally different brain areas? Like what's the kind of fundamental reason that one would be better than the other?
Oh, that's another question. Like I think in some tasks, like they have shown, like especially they use transcranial magnetic stimulation, and like in inhibitory, so like they try to inhibit what occur between the trials.
Okay.
So and that was like one study would use that to like try to block the intertrial period, so as to probe, okay, how does that affect the retention?
Okay.
And I think that, okay, they showed that if you block that, that impairs the retention, if I can remember the study correctly. And that was like transcranial magnetic stimulation over the motor cortex.
And are there fundamental differences, do you think, between interleaved and blocked? Or do you think it's the same brain region, but it's just learning in a better way?
Yeah, so like my expected, based on what I expect, then I will see like maybe increase in activation in the prefrontal cortex and stuff like that, in the planning areas,
right,
and compared to like blocked practice.
Okay.
So that like more activity perhaps is like better for
so working harder.
Working harder.
Right. And in chapter 2, you talk about this elaboration hypotheses, which I hadn't really heard of before. And I suppose, if possible, can you give some kind of more in-depth answer to what does it mean for people to process information more elaborately during acquisition? So is it what we've just talked about, that you have to work harder? Or is it the switching? So what do you mean? What does it mean for it to be more elaborately processed?
Yeah, that's a question. Good question. To be honest, that for me it's a kind of vague, like the whole processing, elaborate processing. But the idea is that if you have different learning tasks and they are trained in an alternate way, interleaved way, then that allows you to compare the difference between the learning task, and in somehow that affects the encoding of the memory, and that gives better consolidation of the memory. That's the way it is presented.
Yeah.
But
so it's just kind of linked to that, and this is kind of for a further chapter, but I think it links in well here, is so with your sequences, you in essence are manipulating timing. So it's always A, B, A, B, A, B, and then you just but then the different races are just longer or shorter lengths of that.
Yep.
While often in sequence learning, it would be the order of the sequence is different as well. So rather than always going left first, you'd maybe go right first.
Yep.
So what was your reasoning to choose just elongating or shortening the length of the gates rather than the order of the gates?
That's a perfect question. That was it was to use something similar to alpine skiing. So it was based on how we train in sports. What can we do? And I think one way to teach athletes is the way we give them learning tasks, and then this is course setting. The other way is how you guide the learners through the different courses. So it was based on a situation where I thought maybe course setting is a good way to probe or understand the contextual interference effect. But yeah.
Because I would imagine that if you had different orders, you'd get a lot more contextual interference than if you were messing around with the timing. So the timing, I imagine you get a lot more generalization. That what I've learned here, I can then, for example, with handwriting, I can do very small handwriting, I can do very large handwriting. But if you start manipulating the order, it's more difficult rather than being able to write the same word, small or large. So do you think you might have got larger contextual interference effects if you manipulated order rather than timing?
Yeah, I think so. And that's the thing about the contextual interference effect, is that when you use the different orders, as you talked about, different sequences and stuff, those effects almost always appear, and quite big effect sizes as well.
Okay.
But in complex sports, those effect sizes are, if they exist, very small.
Okay.
And that's because it's very challenging to do this kind of manipulation.
Right.
So I don't know if that was the best approach to investigate the contextual interference.
Okay.
But it was try to base it on sport. Yeah. But I thought maybe I should have done it very differently. So maybe like different strategies, maybe like different ways to perform the task would have been a better way to do it. But yeah, these are just my thoughts in like retrospect. Yeah.
And so kind of just, I suppose, following on from where you're setting up these ideas, for reinforcement learning, you've got lots of kind of evidence that the way you give reinforcement also has a huge effect. So you can give kind of fixed reinforcement, where you're always giving reinforcement every trial, or you can give it kind of random, where every so often they get a bit, or, you know, so there's different kind of contexts which you can give the. So did you consider that, or is it again just kind of trying to apply these settings first in apply? So you wanted something, you know, the simplest version you could, but did you consider how these kind of, how you give the reinforcement also influences sometimes how effective it is?
I wish I could hear your response on that question first, but it's something I thought about, because I, of course, had read like, I think it was one paper showing like not giving feedback on every trial is like perhaps good for like consolidation, and that affects retention. The thing I think in alpine skiing is that we spend so much time in the ski hall or in the race, and we have so few trials that I think it's very important to use everything that we have. That said, I also think for an athlete it's very hard to like, if you're an athlete and then you perform one trial and then you see the times and then you do the next trial, those trials will be different. So I think in order to understand the strategies better, I think you need to like sample, get some reasonable sample. So it's not just like 2-3 trials, but I think like more trials would be better. And so I think like in terms of this context, I think like a reinforcement schedule where we like give trials after feedback after every trial is good, but I don't know. That was just my consideration.
And I suppose a really kind of general question. So if you were to redo, so what aspect of the methodology would you change, do you think, if you could do it again?
For the reinforcement learning study?
Just, in general, across your whole thesis, like what is there a component where you're like, oh, I wish I did that in a slightly different way?
It's very hard because my PhD is like a very learning process. So without one study or the other, I don't think I would have learned like the way I've done it now. So I think every study is important, but of course I would have done it like differently today. The first, contextual interference, that was very valuable study for like skiing and for myself. I learned something about like effect sizes that I'm maybe interested in. I learned something about how to do this kind of studies. But I don't know if like I set it up in the correct way, so that could be like improved in some kind of way. I think like we could try to train the different strategies in some, in an interleaved way, or do something related to that. If I had done something similar, I would have maybe, that's maybe my interest at the last stages of the doctoral thesis, is that I'm begin to really like the concept of goal-directed learning and like also habitual learning. Okay. And I think that's a key element in alpine skiing, is that coaches sometimes set courses like the same hairpin or the same type of gates all the time. And then I think that what happens is that this creates some habits, how the learner actually do the task.
Because that's actually one of my later questions. So do you think, so how do people, and the kind of differences between planning and execution, so how do people go about looking at these courses, and do they plan, as you say, like, do they have this habit where they just plan the whole race as one before you've even like moved, or is it kind of more of a, as you say, goal directed, and what do you think is better, and the manipulations that you've done in terms of interleave versus blocked and reinforcement versus supervised, do you think they lead into one or the other, or do you think it's just
that's great. That's I think that's a great question. I think in alpine skiing, like the skiers, they typically inspect the courses before they go for a trial, so they are aware of what they should do and stuff like that. So they plan what to do, but I think there is some like big habits involved. It's like you train, you automate your skills, and that's become an automated solution for a specific section of a course. Right. So I think like typically is what you see is that people that have trained a lot, they typically solve the same kind of situation the same. Even though the courses changes and stuff like that, they do the same kind of pattern. So I was not a super good skier, but I was okay, and my coach sits here. But when I look at my video footage of myself, then I see some weird stuff going on. And that's, I always start gate, then I also always skid, like the skid in the first turn. There's no reason to do that, but that's, I think it's a habit how I perform. And similar when it comes to like hairpins and stuff like that, we usually like have some habits. And I think if you look at or listen to the racers in the media and stuff like that, great skiers, they are very aware of these kind of habits. Right. They usually try to have their own setup equipment exactly the same way for every race. Like they have their own setup for this season, and they don't try to change that much. And I think that's because if you change it, that will cause some problems with their habits. And back to your question about interleaved and block practice, I would be very interested to do a study if like interleaved practice, stuff like that, and how we train, for instance, hairpins, to see if one particular kind of training can create habits that you maybe you don't want, and that so that you perform worse in a situation that is very different from the habits that you, or in a situation you trained in.
I suppose so. Kind of count. So in one aspect, we're saying that in the interleaved allows you to be flexible, but then a lot of these elite athletes don't want anything changed because they have these set of primitives that they can just execute. Yep. So which way do you think is it a combination, or do you think that these elite athletes, they're elite because they have these primitives which are successful and that they can just execute without much thought and very automatic, or do you think this is actually something that they shouldn't have?
I think it's a mixture between both. I think to become a good athlete, you need to have habits. Okay. You need to have some automated solution, not for everything. There's always one connections that you can maybe have develop habits for. But in order to improve, it's important to break up habits. Okay. So it's like a difference between where are you in terms of the learning process, and what is your goal? Is it to improve, or is it just to retain what you already have? So if it's to improve, then I think it's really important to break up those habits, especially if they are not good, and replace it with a better version. But if you are good and you're skiing good or perform well in sport, then keep it as is.
And so I suppose this kind of leads into the first experimental results where you're talking about, and again, it surprised me that you can get these elite athletes and show them new techniques and actually see this improvement, which is really, really impressive. In terms of the technique which was shown to be the optimal, you call it wavier, so they become more wavier across the thing. And to me, that sounds like it's the more jerky, right? That they're accelerating and decelerating a lot more with this technique than in comparison to other techniques. Again, so two aspects to that. One, we think of this often when we train people to be smooth, and that to optimize. And we see that a lot with the kind of basic motor control stuff, is that people try to minimize jerk. Yep. So if you let people just make movements, their movements are because they're minimizing jerk, and this technique seems to go against that. Yep. And also, it's been shown that when you have these very jerky movements, they're kind of metabolically demanding, so they use up a lot of energy.
Yep.
So, do you think that this technique, because it was a short course, was optimal because it was a short course? And if you were to, and I kind of talked about that before, if you were to use a longer course, that people would want to use this technique, which might be more metabolically demanding. And is it actually more metabolic demanding, do you think?
Yes, I'm so glad that you picked up that, because that means you have actually understood something about alpine skiing.
I've learned something about alpine skiing.
Because that's one thing, because I like those control theories and like the optimal feedback control theory and stuff like that. And based on that, we should not like use extend strategy, or we should not use extend with rock skis forward strategy, because that will cost a lot. And if you look at racers when they just free ski, then you will not see anyone doing these kind of techniques.
Yep.
So that's because it's a very costly movement to perform. When I ski, I never use any of these techniques because it's very hard to do, and I will be very tired at the end of the course if I do this kind of motions. So it costs a lot. When we set the courses here, we have the times, and then you immediately see that the skiers use some of these techniques in some kind of way, and they use it. So I think the goal of the task determines what they, in some kind of way, do.
Yep.
Now, I think you point to a very interesting result regarding my thesis, and that's, I don't think people should perform like. There was a guy on LinkedIn or Twitter, I can't remember, who said that elite athletes should minimize the cost. That's always the best solution. And I said, reach out to him, and said, no, that cannot be the best solution. And I think we kind of show that. And the best solution is try to use muscular movements, addition, to cause these effects that we are interested in. And I think, this goes against the whole optimal control theory, and in terms of, at least in what is the optimal solution in one kind of way. Yep.
So in a really implied setting, when it's actually in a race, do people have sufficient energy, or is it to be able to do these techniques, or is it that people are going to be so tired by this point that it doesn't actually make sense to do these techniques because you don't have sufficient energy, and so then you're not going to perform it, do it accurately or do it well?
We have some great people here, physiologists would be better to answer that question, but I think it is in alpine skiing, it is very important to be fit. That's the whole thing. We need to be very fit in order to achieve good outcomes. Now, if you have a 16 seconds course and you're going to use this technique, that will impede or depress performance in the end. So you will be very, very tired. If you push the athletes to a course which is 130 minutes, then you will see that they really struggle to implement the technique, and you see that the performance will degrade and suffer. And that's you can see it. That's very you can see it.
And is this why some people in the field are against this technique? Because because it's so possibly metabolically demanding? That could be one thing. Maybe another thing is that people or coaches, they are very interested in how things looks, like the appearance of skiing technique. So when you use this kind of pumping motion and stuff like that, then you use your arms and it doesn't look that great. Right. And so people can think that a skiing technique that looks great is also a good technique, but that could not be an effective one. So that's another thing. Okay. But it could also be, like you said, that it could be so metabolic demanding that you don't want to do that kind of strategy. It's kind of interesting again. My kind of work, if you provide reward, people are willing to produce these kind of movements, right? So they increase stiffness and they'll make that movement, and they're happy to do that. But if you get them to do it for a long period of time, then the effort reward balance shifts and they stop being willing to do it. So it's definitely like this kind of seesaw between effort and reward. Yeah.
And I think you have done some great research on that kind of studies with yours.
Yeah. So great. So moving on to the interleave result. So we've already talked about the fact that the timing versus order. So that's fine. So so I suppose just explaining it a little bit to me. So when in your interleave result, there's an explanation around the long rotation time. Could you just unpack that a little bit for someone who's not in this area?
So rotation time?
Yeah.
That's when the skiers do the lift up. That takes 8 minutes or something, at least in the indoor skiing hall. So that's in compared to a lab-based task where you get you can do a new trial immediately. Okay. Here it's you have to take the lift up towards the top, and then you have to prepare equipment, strap your boots, and prepared for a new trial.
And do you think that could explain the lack of difference between interleaved and blocked?
That could be one explanation. But I don't really know what would be the optimal explanation for these null effects. Mm-hmm. but I suggested that, and I think I also suggested like 10 other explanations.
Yeah.
And that's a combination from a reviewer, which wanted to have like maybe
any possible reason.
four others, and I have already explained 6 others, so then it was like a massive, and that's always with these null effects that it's very hard to,
Okay.
Yeah.
So, so it's moving on to the reinforcement chapter. And some of this is around the stuff which is not actually in the thesis, but in the papers as well. So I found actually a lot of the stuff in the article really, really interesting in terms of choice, what their decisions and what they thought was the best strategy, etc. Yep. So I kind of want to unpack that a little bit as well. Yep. So firstly, is why do you think that skiers do not select the strategy they estimate to be optimal 100% of the time? That feels very odd to me, that they go, well, this strategy A is the one I think is optimal, but I'm going to do this strategy. Why do you think that happened? Or have you any kind of qualitative understanding as to why that wasn't 100%?
Yeah, I think that's, I think race time in alpine skiing is a ratio between signal to noise. Mm-hmm. And I think in alpine skiing, the noise, it's a lot of noise. So the snow can change, things can change, yeah. So if you perform the same action, exactly the same, you will have a different output, okay. I think. So I think one reason why the skier did not choose the optimal strategy is that they have some understanding of the strategy, what the expected value is for each strategy. But I think they are also uncertain. Right. So like, I think there is some, here earlier today I showed the overall means, like the marginal means. But I think there were some differences, and for some skiers, 2 strategies overlapped. Okay. And then they thought maybe I could just pick this strategy, and maybe I could pick this strategy. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter really. So that's one thing that could be the reason why they did not always pick the best strategy. And in this study, we were like, I wish I'd been not that strict, because I said that extend with rock skis forward is the best strategy, yeah. And then I counted if the skiers picked that strategy or not. So it's 0 and 1, and then that's very strict. But then it could also, I also estimated the strategy by taking a simple average for each strategy and then count if the skiers picked the best estimated strategy or not. But that's could be like, I'm very strict. I'm just counting ones and zeros, and maybe that's not what's happening in the athletes' heads in some kind of way. Okay. Because maybe they understand that, oh, I can choose 2 strategies and it doesn't really matter in terms of performance.
Okay. So the reinforcement result where they basically select the 2 strategies which are very similar, and they choose those a lot more than the other 2 groups.
Yep.
To me, that suggests that they've, in maybe in one way, learned a control policy, right? They've learned the fundamental rules of those, that underpin those strategies. And so do you think that that's what they've kind of learned, that somehow through the reinforcement learning, that they've learned a control policy which represents just the rules of those strategies?
I don't really know, to be honest. Okay.
I suppose kind of switch a little bit. So one aspect of it for me is that, well, if you were to actually have a pure reinforcement group,
Yep.
that you don't actually provide them any strategies, so that you've actually given them the landscape to explore in.
Yeah.
How about if you basically just let them off and rewarded them for exploration? So the more varied their technique is, the more reward they get in an exploration group.
Yep.
What do you think you'd see? Like, and because what it seems to be is that they've identified a strategy which is possibly more optimal than the optimal strategy, in the sense of it's simpler and you can get all the benefits of that strategy which happen to the more complex strategy. So do you think they have the capacity to be able to find something which you haven't even thought about yet, if you kind of really push them to explore the possible options?
I thought about lots of time about that question, and what would happen if we just give them opportunity to explore themselves. I think they would have improved.
Okay.
I think they would have come up with some good strategies. Maybe not the strategies that we provided or suggested. But I think I think we need some strategies in some kind of way to push the athletes. I think we need to provide them some choices, some ways to explore in some kind of way. And then maybe they will have come up with an even better strategy than the one we believe to be the best strategy. I really think so. That would be that they would have done that. But I think in terms of the experiment, I think we needed some kind of way to communicate what the skiers should do in some kind of way.
Yep.
So it was like implement it as a bandit task in some kind of way.
Right, and I completely agree, because I think even in the basic science realms, is that if you just give people a task where they can just get rewarded, people don't explore, right? They just keep moving towards this very small region, and because they don't know what the realm of exploration is. So I think it probably does make sense that you do have to provide these strategies, for then they can explore across those strategies, rather than just kind of a completely free model. I don't think they'd probably explore very much at all if you didn't give them that context.
Yep. We have that's interesting. We had the head coach for the Norwegian alpine ski team. He tried to implement reinforcement learning earlier this season with the best skiers in the world. And he did the following. He wanted to make the skiers try some strategies, and then they tested it out, but they learned something, and they come up with their own ideas how to do it better. And that's like we provide them with some information.
Yep.
But I think when you do that, the athletes learn in some kind of way, and maybe that helps them to come up with their own ideas in some kind of way.
Yeah. So I suppose this is a quite difficult question, and I don't know the answer to it. So there's two aspects to reinforcement learning, or the effects of, I suppose, reinforcement. You've got the motivational factor, that it's just motivating to get reward or to get that race time, and versus actually learning from that reward signal. Is there a way that you think that you can kind of try to dissociate just the general motivational effect of this versus an actual reinforcement-based learning effect? So, for example, maybe even dissociating, giving them race times, but it's dissociated from the strategies. Or how important do you think it is, just this more motivational effect?
It's very important. I think one way to try to associate these things is to give the skier. So you have you compare two kind of conditions. One where the skier skis without timing, so ski as fast as you can. Then we have another condition where they ski with the timing as outcome. Okay. Then you need to do that in some kind of randomized block design, or I don't know. Yeah, you need to handle the order effect in some kind of way. But then at least you can estimate what is the average effect of when the skiers perform the task without time, and what is the average effect of when they perform the task with time. So with and without time, and that difference, that contrast, could maybe say something about what is the motivational effect.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I think it's very, very difficult. But I think my experience when you try to publish this stuff is you'll always get this question of is it this motivational effect of having just a reward signal versus are they actually learning better from that reward signal? It's very, you can start looking at it in terms of patients, because you might predict something fundamentally different, for example, Parkinson's disease patients, yep, and how they respond to motivation versus reinforcement learning. But I think it's very, very difficult to dissociate these two, yep, these two factors.
That reminds me of something, because on the retention test, mm-hmm, we did not give them, the athletes, the times.
Okay. So that maybe takes away that motivation effect.
Takes away the motivation effect, and we look at learning, or maybe, yeah.
And this may have been an article, but I might have missed it. So did you observe the key components of reinforcement? So you get kind of increased exploration at the start, and then exploitation. Did you really look at that, and did you see those key, I suppose, factors that you usually associate with reinforcement learning? So you'd expect to see greater exploration in comparison to the supervised learning, for example.
I just explored the raw data, so that's my only impression of it.
So did they explore the different strategies more in the free choice?
Yeah, I think so. They did that, at least in the early stages.
Yep.
Then they tried to explore the different strategies. One thing is that we had this forced exploration phase, where we forced them to try the different, mm-hmm, strategies. But I don't think they had enough samples on each strategies to really understand what is the best strategy. So I think there was some exploration in the first free choice 1 phase, and then in the free choice 2, I think there was full exploration. I think some people or some skiers tried different strategies, but I think they some kind of way exploited. And then in the retention, I think it was full exploitation.
Okay.
But I think we show that some people still change their strategies during that period. And yeah.
Okay. And there's one specific comment in the reinforcement result. You say it's likely that the reinforcement learning group learn not only at the strategy level, but also at the execution level.
Yeah.
Could you kind of unpack that a little bit in terms of what you mean by that?
I think this goes back to your question about the motivational effect.
Okay.
So what we see, just an observation, but I try to write in a way that people can understand what's going on, and maybe build on that. And I think what we see perhaps is that skiers use more arm movements. So you can pump with some arm movements, but if you use massively, that's gonna give you a better outcome.
Okay.
So I think that's one key element that the reinforcement learning group, they learn to do this kind of thing in a way, and that's not happened in other learning groups.
Cool. So the win, stay, lose, shift result, again, was really interesting. And you don't see a difference between the groups, although I suppose it's on the way, it looks like there could be a difference.
Yeah.
So do you think the lack of a difference is key? And do you think that you could manipulate the reinforcement that the time that you're giving to really push those differences? So for example, you could give people a reward signal or a lap time which represents whether they're above or below their mean, for example.
Yeah, that could be one way to do it. So how do you...
So I suppose, do you think it's important that you don't, I suppose with reinforcement learning, that's the key concept, right? That you should exploit when you get rewarded and explore when you get punished.
Yep.
But your result shows that you don't have a difference between groups there.
Yep.
So do you think there's a real fundamental proof that they're learning in a fundamentally different way, even though there's no significant difference between the groups for that analysis?
Yeah, I hope I answer your question correctly. I think there was a difference between the groups, even though not statistically significant. I think we kind of show in some kind of way. That's my interpretation, not scientific, but my own interpretation, that we see that they learn in some kind of different ways.
Okay.
With respect for the coaches, because that's the other, their task was to pick the strategy that they thought was going to be the best for the skier. But that could be like long-term, that could be short-term, that could be really anything. And maybe they didn't read out like the times, a reinforcement signal, in that kind of way. So that's why we see that. I think there's a massive difference in the trend, at least.
Yeah.
So I think the reinforcement learning group, in some kind of way, they use the times better.
Look more.
Look more into it.
Yeah. So you say, as such, it seems that the reinforcement learning group refined the extend strategy to a new level. I think they were kind of adding components to this.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was really interesting, actually, and like one of the kind of key results, insights, because it kind of suggests that they can find new solutions that aren't actually normally coached.
Yep.
And that providing simply reinforcement level learning allows them that capacity to learn.
Yep.
So I suppose, why do you think this strategy emerged? So in terms of when you look at the mechanics of it, does it make sense what they did? And also, could this possibly highlight positives and negatives of reinforcement learning? Because it shows that they adapted the strategy that you told them to do, so they could be learning and have positives, but they also could learn bad habits quite easily, I think, in that sense.
Yep. I think, first, I think that strategy to a new level actually makes sense in terms of mechanics. So more movements, extension movements, it's gonna give some good outcomes if the snow allows it.
Okay.
So that's another, like, if you have hard, compact snow, then that extension movement is gonna give you a better time. That's at least what I expect. So, and I think what's happened is that the skiers learned, of course they learned about the strategies, but they also, during the learning experiment, they got some initial ideas how to do it, but then they learned how to perform it in better. And it was really not possible to like block this kind of execution level in this kind of study. Yeah, so I think they like learned like everything, both how to perform the strategy better, and they learned that that strategy was good and if we just do this a bit more, then yeah, that's gonna give some desirable effects.
And I suppose, because there's kind of, one of my final questions for this chapter is that if reinforcement learning is so beneficial, what's the point of coaches? But in relation to that kind of leads into my final point, last one, is that, this reinforcement, it showed, in your situation, showed it had a positive effect, but I suppose it could quite easily, something negative could be added,
Yep.
which needs to be then uncoached. So do you think that's why you couldn't simply just not have coaches?
Yeah. Can you please repeat the last question again?
So you showed that they adapted this strategy,
Yep.
and it had a positive effect.
Yep.
But I feel like by having this freedom, it means that they could also have learned a bad habit.
Yep.
And you've talked, and so do you think that this is a possibility, that giving them this freedom means that they had something which was positive, but also something negative could also be
Yep.
adapted to the strategy? And do you think that's where coaches come into play as well?
Yeah, I think that could easily happen, but I think as long as you provide the athlete the times,
Okay.
that provides them an objective measure if that strategy is a good strategy or not, and then if they are improving or stuff like that. So I think that's really a key in order to not form habits, to have this time, at least in alpine skiing. I think also coaches play an important role here, because their role is to break up habits once they see it, and it's not producing desirable effects. So yeah, I think one way, that's the reason why we have a coach, is that he can maybe detect the habits and try to break them up and improve it if they see that's.
And so one aspect of this as well, so do you feel that there's a potential negative for relying so much on race times? And I kind of think back to, so I've done a fair bit of research into stroke rehabilitation, and there's actually a big shift away from looking at function, so how quickly can you perform, pick up a cup, and looking at impairment in terms of the quality of that movement. Because even though in the short term, focusing on impairment is actually negative for function, it slows you down, it means that you're actually slower at doing that, but longer term, it means that you actually end up being faster, and that behavior actually generalizes more. So is there that issue in terms of, I suppose, basing the feedback, the reinforcement feedback on race times?
So I think what you see in the reinforcement learning is that you maybe get some quick improvement, like really skill benefits. It improves massively. And I don't think there's also an execution level, so that there is only so much that you can do with this kind of reinforcement learning strategy, and you need input from an external teacher or a coach, so as to improve learning. And I think this balance is it's the key to good coaching. Maybe try, and that's what I try to write in the discussion, is that I don't say that this is the final solution about learning. Just go out and do reinforcement learning. I think maybe it can help skiers to understand what is a good strategy or not, and get some overall idea, and then maybe train with reinforcement learning. But then also sometimes have coaches there to give some feedback how they can perform even better. Okay. And I think I try to differentiate between action selection and try to between action and execution. And then I think we need both.
Okay. So I'm going to finish with some more kind of just general questions.
Yep.
So how would this change for a beginner skier? So do you think this would be fundamentally different for, I'm guessing it would. So if you provide different strategies, do you think you'd see bigger differences between these strategies, for example, or interleave block, but also reinforcement, supervisory learning? Well, how would this change with beginner learners or people who aren't elite?
The strategies in themselves, or what?
Just in terms of the results that you've found.
Yep.
How generalizable is this to outside of elite skiers?
I think it's for beginners. They lack experience. So I think then you cannot do this kind of these strategies at all.
Okay.
They will not be able to execute them. They will not be able to understand them.
Yep.
So for beginners, I think it's more like giving them how can they survive on the hill in some kind of way. And then you can try to giving them choices. Okay, maybe they can carve.
Okay.
So let the skis go down and then carve up to keep don't increase speed. And then they can learn that compared to just skidding down the ski resort. And for kids in alpine skiing, they can learn the difference between being in a very tucked position or standing up. And that's
okay,
enough for them. But I think these are very high level skiers, and it would not have worked with.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so I suppose if you had to define, what's the one key limitation and the one key strength of your thesis?
I think one key strength, to take that first, is that I think I managed to do at least one informative study with very good skiers. They came from Norway, Sweden. I haven't paid anything for them. They took all the costs, including lift tickets, hotels, travel expenses, and get them involved in the study and be interested in doing this kind of study. That's very rare in this kind of field.
Mm-hmm.
So that's we managed to do this kind of study. That's, I think, it's good. I wish, for my limitation, I think I wish I not do local positioning system in the ski hall. And the reason is that I don't think it really helps to understand the strategy better in some kind of way. Because we just look at one position for the skier, but what is actually happening is different segments of the body, and to understand the effects of these strategies and how we can optimize the strategies, that would be, then we would require to build a 3D model with all these segments and then look at how things changes. And that was actually the plan to do in this thesis. But we ended up in with the local positioning, and that was because the ski hall is very tricky to do this kind of field studies, and there is a roof, and it makes it very challenging.
And so this is kind of one final one is, what would be the really interesting next step? So I can see so aspects around this I thought is interesting is that things like pose estimation, where you don't need, you can just have a camera now, right? And you can detect as many points as you want really on, maybe 2 cameras and get that information in a very, so you could even go on, I'm guessing, go on to an actual ski slope and get that kind of data. So where do you think would be the kind of really interesting next step?
I think, as you say, that will be the interesting step. Like doing this kind of reinforcement learning again would be interesting, but use like these post-estimation techniques or something like that, and try to see what's really happening. What do the skiers learn? And try to understand that better. That will require a lot, but that will be a very nice direction for the future. The thing is that I have used up my entire population for this kind of study. I don't have any larger population, and that would require me to focus on another skill. So then we need to do the entire process again, finding a skill where it's possible to improve performance, and then do a new learning study on that. So that will be another PhD.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the second opponent. Thank you for both of you for a very interesting discussion about your dissertation. Now the examination committee will leave the room to evaluate the dissertation and make their final decision. And I ask the rest of you to be staying in this auditorium. We will come back and I will announce the committee's decision within 5 to 15 minutes. Thank you. The examination committee has found Christian Magelssen's dissertation of December 19, 2024 satisfactory. And as rector of Norwegian School of Sports Sciences, I hereby award Christian Magelssen the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, PhD in Sport Science. Congratulations. Before I close the session, I would again say thank you very much to the scientific committee, the whole scientific committee, for a very comprehensive written evaluation. And again, thank the two opponents for brilliant questions and great discussions with Christian here. And to you, Christian, congratulations. This is a big day. This is a big day for you. It's a big achievement. You have achieved now the highest degree in academia. Congratulations with that. It's also a big day for your supervisors, co-authors, collaborators. As I know, has been many of you collaborating with Christian during this project. Congratulations to you as well. Congratulations to Christian's family. It's a big day for the family. Congratulations to Department of Physical Performance. And this is a big day for NIH as an institution as well, for NIH as a specialized university. We raised the Norwegian flag outside the main entrance today to honor Christian and to honor this ceremony. And that symbolizes the importance of our doctoral students in our mission as a specialized university in sports sciences. So, Christian, you are number 248 with a PhD in sports science from Norwegian School of Sport Sciences, and you will receive your official diploma at the semester start ceremony in August 2025. But now you'll receive our traditional gift, institutional gift, as we give all our PhDs when they are finished. It's a tin spoon number 246. So remember this day when you see this spoon on your... Congratulations. Thank you. Then I declare the disputation for completed, and I ask the committee, head of department, and our new Doctor of Philosophy to join me in a procession out of the auditorium. And to the audience, thank you very much.